Hello and welcome to today's webinar titled The New 510K, How Do You Show Substantial Equivalence Without Using a Predicate? My name is John Spear and I'm the founder of Greenlight Guru, and I will be the moderator for today's event. We've got a really great presentation scheduled for you today. I know our presenter, Mike Drews, is really looking forward to teaching you all about, well, maybe not all about, but quite a bit about the new safety and performance-based 510K from FDA and how it can be used to show substantial equivalence without using a predicate. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our presenter and his consultancy, Vascular Sciences, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, today's webinar is going to run for about 90 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end where Mike will answer as many questions from you as time permits. So I encourage you throughout the entire presentation today to submit your questions in the questions box, and we'll get to many of them as time permits. Also, this is the most common question that I get on every single webinar that we do. Yes, we are recording this. Yes, you'll get a full copy of the recording and the slides at the conclusion of today's webinar. So yes, it's coming to your inbox probably later today, maybe tomorrow. And yes, there is a handout that Mike has prepared as well. So some supplemental materials will be provided to you. And again, that's all going to come to your inbox. So be on the lookout for that email sometime here very soon after today's presentation. I also like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've participated in one of our training sessions before, then you know that we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission at Greenlight Guru. And it's likely a mission that many of you probably have at your companies as well. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free training sessions or by partnering with world-class medical device consultants like today's presenter, Mike Drews, as well as through the award-winning Greenlight medical device success platform software. For those of you who have said you were interested in scheduling a brief intro call with Greenlight Guru to learn how you can effortlessly link your risk management and design controls in our fully traceable quality management system success platform software, someone from our team will be reaching out to you after today's webinar. And if you haven't connected with us yet, but you would like to, simply head over to www.greenlight.guru after the webinar and schedule a brief intro call with us so that we can better understand your needs and requirements and how our products and solutions might help you. In doing so, you'll learn that the very best medical device companies are leveraging our purpose-built quality management system software to meet other needs like market approvals and clearances from FDA, compliance with EU MDR and IVDR, ISO 13485 certification, as well as make audits and inspections just a lot easier so that you can push beyond compliance, baseline compliance, and move towards delivering true quality within your company and impacting the medical devices that you're bringing to patients. So now let's get on to today's presentation, and let me give a proper introduction to today's presenter and a distinguished partner of ours at Greenlight Guru, Mike Drews. Mike Drews is president of Vascular Sciences, a consulting and training company offering a broad range of services to medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies, including creative regulatory strategy and competitive regulatory intelligence, regulatory submission design, FDA presentation, preparation, and defense. Mike is internationally recognized expert who brings a breadth of knowledge and hands-on experience in his teachings from the ongoing work he does for FDA, Health Canada, and other regulatory and governmental agencies around the world. He's also a featured keynote speaker on cutting-edge medical technologies and regulatory affairs. And if any of you are familiar with the Global Medical Device Podcast, the #1 podcast in the medical device industry, then you'll probably recognize his voice right away because he is a frequent and longtime guest of the show. So without further ado, let me hand it over to today's presenter, Mike Drews.
Thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. And I want to thank you and my many friends at Greenlight Guru for giving me the opportunity to host today's webinar. And a special thanks to everyone in the audience, both those of you that are listening live right now and those of you that might be listening to the recording in the future, because without you, then there would be no point of us doing this. So as John said, the topic of today's the topic of today's webinar is what I call the new 510K, and I'm putting the word new in air quotes because we'll talk about whether this is in fact new or not. Something called the safety and performance-based pathway, or what I call the safety and performance-based 510K. How do you show substantial equivalence without using a predicate? John took the liberty already of sharing a bit about my background with you, and there is a copy of my bio in the handout that comes along with this webinar. So the only thing that I want to emphasize a little bit, especially for those in the audience that might not already know me, is that in addition to working as a consultant for a wide variety of medical device companies, I also work as a consultant for the FDA, as well as Health Canada and some of the other regulatory agencies around the world. And quite frankly, the reason why I mention that is because there's not a lot of people that can say that work on both sides of that proverbial fence, so to speak. And so I really try to use that to my advantage. And as John mentioned, I also spend a fair amount of my time doing webinars and podcasts and columns for Greenlight Guru, as well as other organizations. You can find links to all of those resources on this page, as well as in the bio and the handout for today's webinar. So without further ado, let's start getting into the topic at hand. And just to kind of get a sense of where we are as an audience, I have just a couple of quick polling questions that I'd like you to respond to. There's just 3 of them. John, if we're ready, here's question number 1. Have you worked on a 510K device in the past? Yes or no? So we'll give you a few seconds to respond to that. If you can just click either yes or no, and we'll give the audience a few seconds, John, to respond. Have you worked on a 510K device in the past?
And folks, with these polling questions, they're quick, so we want to get through these fairly quickly. All right, Mike, we got about 80% of the respondents in, so let's share the results. 70% said yes, 30% said no.
Okay, 70% of you have worked on a 510K in the past. That's good to know. Certainly not surprising, because as I'm sure most in the audience know, the 510K overall, there's many different types, which we'll talk about later, but the 510K overall is the most common pathway to market for medical devices here in the United States. So John, let's move on to the second of the 3 polling questions. Do you currently work on a 510K device? And if so, what type of 510K is it? And this is a multiple choice question. So traditional, special, abbreviated, or maybe you've worked on more than one, or maybe none of them, or maybe you don't know what any of those things are. So take a pick of one of those 5 options: traditional, special, abbreviated, more than one, or none, or don't know.
All right, just a few more seconds here.
Be curious to see if our statistics in our audience. Sorry, go ahead, John.
I was just gonna say we got 80% of the results. What were you gonna say before I share the results?
I was just curious to see if the results from our audience are reflective of the statistics of the industry overall. So why don't you share the results with us, John?
Sure. So 45% traditional, 2% special, 2% abbreviated, 20% more than one, 31% none or don't know.
Well, I'm a little surprised at that last one. About a third of the audience either none of the above or don't know. But the other numbers are somewhat reflective of the industry in general, although at a much lower level, because as we'll talk about, the traditional 510K is the most common type of 510K. About 70% of 510Ks are traditional. Special 510Ks are the next most common. About 20% approximately are special. And finally, the abbreviated 510K is the least common, the least popular. About 4 to 5% of 510Ks are of that type. So that's how our little pool compares to the rest of the big world out there. And finally, the last polling question to see where we are as an audience. And again, this is just a simple yes or no response. Are you considering using the safety and performance-based pathway either right now or perhaps in the future? Are you considering using the safety and performance-based pathway now or in the future? Yes or no? I'm guessing the answer to that one is probably going to be yes for most people, John, because if not, why would they be here?
All right, we have about 80% of responses. Let's share the results, and your assumption is correct. 87% said yes, 13% said no.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you everybody for who participated, because that kind of gives me a sense of where we are as an audience so that I can tailor the content appropriately. So here's what I'd like to try to cover in the time that we have together today. First of all, what is the safety and performance-based 510K and why was it created? How is it similar and different to other types of 510Ks? How do you show substantial equivalence? Is it possible to show substantial equivalence without, in fact, using a predicate? What are the advantages and disadvantages of using the SP 510K? What types of devices are currently eligible and what types of devices might become eligible in the future? And finally, what's the future of the SP 510K? Will it gain in popularity or will it sort of wither on the vine, kind of like the abbreviated 510K has done for the last 20 years? And then to the extent that I can, I'm happy to add as many tips and tricks, and then we'll wrap this up with a few final thoughts on the very end, and then we'll, as John said, we'll have a little Q&A at the end, and then we'll continue on. So just to, before we get into the details of the safety and performance-based pathway, let's just kind of take a step back and have a real quick review of where and how the 510K fits into the medical device universe. And I'd like to start out with the question, how many ways, how many different pathways are there to get medical devices onto the market here in the United States? Well, bottom line, there are many of them. And I cannot possibly in this short webinar talk about all of the different pathways and the advantages and disadvantages to each. But I have discussed this in other podcasts and other webinars that I've done for Greenlight. And specifically, I did a webinar on pathways to market where I talk about all of the different pathways. But in a nutshell, there are advantages and disadvantages to each and every one. So how can you know which pathway to take, whether it's the 510K or something else, if you don't, A, know what all of your options are, and then B, know what the advantages and disadvantages are of each and every one? In other words, if you don't have that basic information, how can you possibly do your job? And suffice it to say, you do not need to take the path most traveled unless, of course, it's to your advantage. Clearly, the 510K is the workhorse of the medical device industry here in the United States. The question is why? A lot of people think that it's the most common because it's the best, or perhaps some people might even think it's the only pathway. Well, I've never made such an assumption. McDonald's is one of the most successful restaurants in the world. Is it because they make a good hamburger? Not so much. Just because lots of people go to McDonald's does not mean that it's a good restaurant. Just because a lot of people use the 510K doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best, and it certainly doesn't mean it's the only pathway that we can use to market. But we're obviously going to be focusing on the 510K and specifically one form of the 510K, the SP 510K, in today's webinar. But again, just to kind of give you a sense of the broadness of the universe that we live in, this is not so short list of the 9 different major pathways that we have for bringing medical devices onto the market here in the United States. And under many of these pathways, there are sub-pathways. Like, for example, I mentioned with the 510K, there's the traditional, the special, the abbreviated, and now the safety and performance-based 510K. So when you take into account all the different sub-pathways, there are more than 20 different pathways that we can bring medical devices onto the market here in the United States, more than 20 of them. In addition to that, if you want to throw some icing on the cake, another thing that you should know about, and I've done webinars on these topics as well, the Breakthrough Devices program, as well as the Safer Technologies program, the STEP program. These are not pathways to market, per se. It's not like you get a BDP or a step in lieu of a 510K or a PMA. You would get it in addition to the 510K or the PMA. And if you do get a BDP or a step, there are certain advantages or incentives that come along with it. And so you can mix and match these pathways in many, many different ways. And of course, if we get into combination products, a webinar that I did for Greenlight Guru just a few months ago on combination products, now the possible combinations of these pathways, what I call combination regulatory strategy, those numbers go up exponentially. So we're going to be focusing on the 510K, obviously, in this webinar, where it fits in the medical device universe specifically. Here is my medical device pyramid. Some of you may have seen it before. I've used it in some of my other webinars. But on the bottom here, we have what I call Class 0 medical devices. FDA does not use the phrase Class 0, but I do, and I really think they should. These are the wellness devices. These are not regulated by the FDA in any way, shape, or form. One level above that are the Class 1 or 2 exempt devices. Exempt in this context means that no formal review of the device is required by the agency, no 510K, no de novo, no PMA, what have you. You still need to have FDA registration, you still need to have a quality management system, design controls, and so on, but no formal review of the device. One level above that, which is what we're talking about here, are the Class 1 and 2 non-exempt devices, which would include the 510K, the topic of today's discussion, pardon me, or the alternative to the 510K would be the de novo. And then finally, at the apex of this pyramid are the Class 3 devices. And in the Class 3 universe, the most plausible pathway to markets are the PMA, the pre-market approval, as well as the HDE, the humanitarian device exemption. So we're talking about this second to the top level here today, and specifically the portion of that level dealing with the 510K, and even more specifically, the sub-portion of that level dealing with one type of 510K, that is the safety and performance 510K. All right, so when is a 510K required? Well, there are two criteria, essentially, that we have to meet in order to consider a 510K. Well, the first criteria is risk or classification. The class of the device has to be less than Class 3, but greater than Class 0. In other words, the subject device has to be usually a Class 2, sometimes a Class 1. That's criteria number one. And criteria number two is when the device does not have a suitable predicate. In other words, it's not substantially equivalent to another device that we have already on the market here in the United States. But just because, to just go off on a quick tangent here, just because a device does have a good predicate doesn't necessarily mean that we have to use the 510K. In other words, I've worked on many devices over the years where I had a very strong predicate, and I was more than 100% confident that I could have got it through the FDA and onto the market as a 510K. However, we didn't do it as a 510K. Instead, we did it as a de novo because, unlike what some people seem to understand, there are some very significant advantages of the de novo over the 510K. That discussion is beyond the context of today's webinar, but again, I have gone into those kinds of discussions in much more detail. Specifically, I did a webinar for Greenlight on the de novo a couple of years ago, and that's a topic that John and I have talked about many times in the podcast series that he mentioned. So even if you have a device that you think that you can bring it onto the market as a 510K, before you go too far down that path, it might be a good idea just to kind of take a quick look at the de novo to see if there's some opportunities that you might be missing. And finally, just to wrap up this quick review so that we can get into the meat of this, the SP510K, what are the two most important components of a successful 510K? Simply put, substantial equivalence and risk. I don't care, quite frankly, if you fill out all the forms properly, if you dot all your I's and you cross all your T's. The most important components of a successful 510K is substantial equivalence and risk. If you don't have a rock solid substantial equivalence argument, and if you don't have a rock solid risk mitigation strategy, then you are not going to be successful with your 510K, certainly first time out of the box. think about it this way. There are many devices that have come onto the market here in the U.S. under the 510K in the past, say 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. But if that same device came to the FDA today with the same submission, it might not get through. So the question is, what has changed? Has the regulation changed? Absolutely not. The regulation for the 510K has not changed one letter, one word since it was created in 1976. Yeah, FDA has put out a number of guidances in the last almost 50 years, but the regulation itself has not changed. But what has changed quite a bit, and again, this is beyond the topic of today's conversation, but what has changed quite a bit is the level of scrutiny, if you will, that FDA is applying to certain portions of these submissions. And to get into this a tiny bit further, one of the things that bothers me a lot about how a lot of people approach regulatory is it seems to be very wishy-washy. In other words, it's not very analytical. So as an engineer, my background is in biomedical engineering. That's what my PhD is in. I tend to try to look at things a little more analytically sometimes. So is there a governing equation of the 510K? Well, there are two fundamental equations of the 510K. The first is that a 510K is a combination of substantial equivalence and risk. That's equation number one. And equation number two is that substantial equivalence involves both labeling and technology. So if we take equation number two and substitute back into equation number one, we get what I call the governing equation of the 510K, which is a successful 510K has to address labeling and technology. That's the substantial equivalence portion of the 510K. Substantial equivalence portion of the 510K have to address that, and we also have to address risk. Simply put, if you want to have a successful 510K, you have to solve the above equation. If you have a valid and defensible solution, then a 510K is a good option for you to consider. If you don't have a valid solution, or if you can't defend your solution, now you probably need to consider something else. Maybe a de novo if it's still class 2, but there's no predicate, or if you're not class 2, then you would be in the class 3, the PMA world. Bottom line, don't focus just simply on what the regulation says. Yeah, what the regulation says is important, but that's not what is most important. What is most important is focus instead on understanding what I like to call the regulatory logic or the thinking process, which, at least in my not so humble opinion, is infinitely more important than the regulation itself. And the last thing that I want to say, which a lot of people seem to either have forgotten or, quite frankly, never knew, is that when the 510K was originally created by Congress almost 50 years ago in 1976, it was meant to be the exception rather than the rule. I'll say that one more time. When the 510K was created 45 years ago by Congress, it was meant to be the exception rather than the rule. Fast forward to today, almost 50 years later, that's become reversed. It is now the rule rather than the exception. And here's a quote from a friend of mine, David Kessler, who headed up the FDA for most of the 1990s. He said that the 510K pathway provision, which was meant as an exception, is essence a little loophole. That exception became the rule. And he goes on to say, so the vast majority of medical devices today, regrettably, and that's his word, not mine, regrettably are regulated under this framework. There are a litany of reasons why the 510K, although it is the most common pathway to market, it is without a doubt the most controversial pathway to market, more controversial not only than any other pathway in the medical device world, but it's more controversial than anything that we have in the drug or biologic world as well, for lots of different reasons I won't get into here. Okay, now let's go and start to drill into in a little more detail, specifically the safety and performance-based pathway, or the safety and performance, the SP 510K. What is it? Why was it created? So according to the regulatory textbook, if you will, the safety and performance-based pathway is an expansion of the abbreviated 510K for certain well-understood devices. It's an expansion of the abbreviated 510K for certain well-understood devices, and I'm going to go into that in much more detail in just a couple of minutes. But before I do, let's talk a tiny bit about the second part of this question. Why was this particular 510K created, this new form of 510K? Well, as FDA suggests in the claim above, it could be sort of an update to the abbreviated 510K. That's certainly part of the story. It could be politics. let's be honest, when Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner, announced the formation of the new SB 510K back in 2018, I think it was, so about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a big sort of a competition, if you will, between what we do here in the U.S. versus what our friends do on the other side of the pond in the EU. And so clearly there were political motivations for doing this as well. If there weren't, then explain how we could, get by with the previous 510Ks for, the better part of 40 years without creating this quote unquote new one. And then finally, maybe another reason why this was created is because, quite frankly, so many people screw up substantial equivalence. I'll share with you a quick statistic. 75% of 510Ks that are submitted to the FDA today, 75% of them are rejected first time out of the box. And of those that are rejected, about 85% are rejected specifically because of substantial equivalence. So I find it fascinating how so many people think they understand the concept of substantial equivalence. Well, if you do, how do you explain those statistics that I just shared with you? And one of my most popular webinars that I've done with Greenlight.Guru is a deep dive into the 510K and specifically substantial equivalence. So I highly recommend checking out that webinar if you really want to test your understanding of substantial equivalence. Here's the information on the webinar on the screen right now. Again, you're going to have this in the handout that will be available after today's webinar as well. Speaking of substantial equivalence and the number of people that screw it up, how consistent are we with our substantial equivalence determinations? I have to be a little careful what I say here because this is something that I've been working on as sort of a personal project for the last several months. The short answer is we are not very consistent, and here's why. Because I've started to do sort of an informal survey. So far, I've involved 12 people, all colleagues, all friends of mine, a combination of both current and former CDRH reviewers, as well as seasoned industry regulatory professionals with varying degrees of experience. Some of them have been around for a very long time like me. Some of them are former graduate students of mine who are, literally wet behind their ears. They just started this game. I presented them the exact same hypothetical medical device and the same predicate, and I asked them to give me their determination whether these two devices were substantially equivalent or not. Now, admittedly, this is a small sample and biased in the sense that I know all these 12 people, but unbiased in the sense that it is a broad mix of people, both from FDA as well as industry and varying levels of experience. But here's the results that I've gotten so far. 5 of the 12 people said that these two devices were substantially equivalent, whereas 7 said they were not. Now, I just find it's kind of interesting. I'll leave this as a sort of a rhetorical question, but if anybody wants to comment on this during the Q&A session at the end, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But we've been playing this game, this 510K and substantial equivalence game now for 45 years. What does that say about our understanding of substantial equivalence? Einstein, very smart guy, Einstein said, if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. So I just throw it out there as something to ponder, something to consider, in our understanding of the 510K and substantial equivalence. So getting more specific now, how is the SP 510K similar and different to other types of 510Ks? Well, first of all 510Ks, including this quote-unquote new SP 510K, they all rely on substantial equivalence, but they rely on substantial equivalence in very, very different ways. So just as a quick review of the different types of 510K, the most common type of 510K is the traditional, as I said earlier. About 70%, give or take, of 510Ks are the traditional type. And in terms of substantial equivalence, for a traditional 510K, we need to show substantial equivalence compared to another device already on the market here in the United States, what we call a predicate device. Could be one of our company's previous devices or a competitor's device, it really doesn't matter, but we're showing substantial equivalence to another device already on the market. The other type of 510K is a special 510K. The special 510Ks can be used for a variety of reasons, But the most common reason why a special 510K is used is because a medical device company has a device on the market now under the 510K. They want to make a change to that device. That change could be either in terms of labeling or design or, something else. They want to notify the FDA of that change. So typically that change notification is in the form of a special 510K. And so with a special 510K, we still need to show substantial equivalence. But in this case, we need to show that our changed, our modified device, whatever you want to call it, is substantially equivalent to our pre-changed device, the device that was on the market prior to making any change to it. So we're still showing substantial equivalence, but in a different way compared to the traditional 510K. And finally, the third type of 510K, which has been around now since 1998, is the abbreviated 510K. And once again, we still need to show substantial equivalence, but in this case, we show substantial equivalence to some kind of a recognized standard, a consensus standard, a guidance document, that kind of thing. And that's why, as we'll talk about more in just a couple of minutes, the abbreviated 510K is very, very similar to, maybe substantially equivalent to, the SP 510K, because the SP 510K also relies on showing substantial equivalence to a standard or a guidance or something like that. FDA introduced at the time what was called this new 510K paradigm, where the abbreviated and the special 510Ks were introduced. The traditional 510K was created in 1976, but the special and the abbreviated came in 1998, and yet still people refer to it as the new 510K. Well, I guess it depends on what your definition of new is. Do we need anything else? Well, now we have the safety and performance-based 510K, which we'll continue to talk about in more detail in the coming minutes. But the other thing that I just wanted to mention here, which I also think is a gaping hole in our medical device regulatory system, is we still, to this day in 2021, do not have a formal, what I like to call a catch-up 510K. And I don't want to talk about this in too much detail because it's a different topic, but really we have no way to notify FDA of a series of changes that we may have made to an existing medical device that all individually have been handled under a letter to file. And the reason why this is so problematic is because some of you are familiar with the phrase predicate creep, which is the Achilles heel of the 510K. Well, what we're talking about here is change creep. We make a change to a device. We handle that under letter to file. We don't notify FDA. We make another change to the device. It's not a significant change. We handle that via letter to file. We don't notify FDA. We make a third non-significant change. We don't notify FDA, and so on and so on. When you consider each of those changes incrementally, it's probably not a big deal. But at some point, after some number of changes, all of those changes add up, and now the sum of those changes might become significant. So we don't have a formal mechanism in place to notify FDA of the sum of all of these changes. Now, unlike a lot of regulatory professionals, I refuse to use regulation as an excuse to hold me back. Just because we do not have a regulatory mechanism in place to do this doesn't mean that I can't do it. What I will do is I will take a traditional 510K, or in some cases a special 510K, and I will turn that into a catch-up 510K. And again, I won't get into the details of how specifically we do that. I talk about in the change management webinar that I've done with Greenlight a while ago, so that's available for you. But don't use regulation as an excuse to hold you back. Just because we don't have a mechanism in place that allows us to do it, quite frankly, that's a cop-out. It's up to us to figure out a way to do what we need to do, whether the regulation provides a mechanism for us to do it or not. And there are other, I think, weaknesses that, in the 510K that we don't have that we could, but that's the topic of a different discussion. So just a couple of years ago, just before the beginning of the pandemic, I think, FDA put out this guidance on the new safety and performance-based 510K, which I would argue, as we're going to continue here, is essentially very similar, if not substantially equivalent, to the abbreviated 510K that was created about 20 years ago. And I hope everybody appreciates my regulatory pun there, my not so subtle use of humor here. So, but I also find it interesting that the name of this pathway, the safety and performance-based pathway, well, when you think about it, shouldn't all submissions, all 510Ks, PMAs, de novos, HDEs, CDEs, and so on, shouldn't they all be safety and performance-based? So what is unique here? Nothing. There's really nothing new here. Or, maybe it's the politics, as I alluded to earlier. So what are the criteria? Now we're really going to start to get into the details of the SP 510K here. So what are the criteria that we need to meet in order to consider the SP 510K pathway? The first criteria is classification. The device has to be less than, less than or equal to class 2. In other words, it cannot be class 3. Well, I take it back. There are a small number of devices that are class 3 devices, but they have 510Ks. Let me say that one more time. There are a small number of class 3 devices, but they are 510Ks. They are not PMAs. They are very much the exception rather than the rule, but average regulatory professionals know the rules. The best ones know the exceptions. So most of the time, a 510K is for class 2 or lower devices. And remember, the other end of the spectrum, as I said earlier, it has to be greater than class 0. I had a conversation just this morning with one of my newer customers who has a wellness device and they want to get a 510K on that wellness device. And I said, no. You can't have your cake you can't have it, both ways. If you want to have a wellness device, fine. If you want to have a regulated medical device, fine. You can have both, but you can't get a 510K on a wellness device. That would make absolutely no sense. In terms of labeling, the device has to have the same indications for use and the intended use, both of them, as the predicate. And please notice I'm putting purposely the word same here in quotes, because same does not necessarily mean literally the same, word for word, letter by letter, punctuation mark by punctuation mark. They have to be close, they have to be similar, but they don't have to be identical. And in terms of technology, similar idea. The device has to have the same technological characteristics of the predicate. Well, that rarely ever happens. Sometimes it does, but rarely. Or if it has different technological characteristics than the predicate, then those technological differences cannot do two things. One, they cannot raise or create new or additional questions of safety and efficacy. That's requirement number one. Requirement number two is they cannot create new or increased risks compared to the predicate. Those are the requirements right out of the textbook, so to speak, with a little bit of paraphrasing from me, but right out of the textbook. And for what I have on the screen right now, there's absolutely nothing new here. In fact, I hope this sounds very familiar to everybody in the audience because this has been true since 1976. Absolutely nothing has changed. Okay, so what has changed? What has new specifically with the SP 510K? The only new criteria, whether it's a significant criteria or not, I'll leave that up to you to decide. The only new criteria is the performance criteria. In other words, the device needs to meet all of the FDA identified, what I should say, FDA pre-identified performance criteria, which would show up in applicable guidance, and I'll show you some examples of that in just a moment. So the only thing new here with regard to the SP 510K is the line number 4 there in red. Everything else has been around for a very long time. Simply put, if you meet all of the above criteria, then you can consider the SP 510K. If you don't meet those criteria, then the SP 510K is contraindicated, and you need to consider something else. Some other form of a 510K, like a traditional or a special, or perhaps an abbreviated, although if you don't qualify for the special, if you don't qualify for the SP 510K, you're probably not going to qualify for the abbreviated because they're so similar. But you need to consider some other form of 510K, or you need to consider a de novo if you're still class 2 but not substantially equivalent, or if you're not class 2, now you might have to consider a PMA or an HDE or one of those other pathways that I had on the screen a few minutes ago. So here's a few reminders and recommendations. First of all, the SP 510K is voluntary, it's not mandatory. Even if you do qualify for the SP 510K, you can still show substantial equivalence, what I like to call the old-fashioned way. In other words, you can still do a traditional 510K where you pit your device head-to-head against a predicate device and you do the testing, what I call an apples-to-apples comparison. You could always do that. You don't have to use the SP 510K even if you qualify for it. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is, as we'll talk about in more detail in the coming minutes, you do not have to show in the SP 510K, you do not have to show substantial equivalence to a specific device. You show it, in other words, to a predicate. Instead, you show it to a standard, a guidance, or something like that. And here's the logic. If you show your device is substantially equivalent to a standard, in other words, it meets the standard, and all other devices in that particular product code also conform to that standard, then it stands to reason that your device, this is the regulatory logic, your device is substantially equivalent to those other devices. In other words, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. I'm not saying that I agree with that logic. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but that is the regulatory logic to understand the SP 510K. You're not showing substantial equivalence to another specific predicate device, rather than you're showing it to a standard. But even if you do use the SP 510K, and there's a little bit of an irony or perhaps even a hypocrisy here, you still need to identify a predicate. Why? And people, you have to scratch their head to figure out this one, because FDA wants to see comparisons beyond performance testing purposes. In other words, you still have to do a labeling comparison. You still have to do a technology comparison, your mechanism of action, your operating principle, and how it works, and so on and so on. So the SP 510K will help you in terms of demonstrating substantial equivalence to a standard, but you still need the predicate to demonstrate the other requirements of the 510K, specifically substantial equivalence to the labeling, to the intended use and the indications for use, to the technology, to the mechanism of action, and so on. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention on this particular slide, because somebody asked me this question recently, if we do the SP 510K, can we end up with a non-substantially equivalent determination, an NSE determination from the FDA in an SP 510K? And the answer is yes, it is possible. Not on the performance testing side, because I think that, at least from an engineering perspective, is pretty straightforward. But FDA might not agree with your labeling comparison, or they might not agree with your technology comparison. And if that's the case, then you might end up with a not substantially equivalent determination, an NSE. How do you mitigate that risk? It's very easy. For those of you that know me, I'm a big fan of the pre-submission process, or the pre-sub. Take it to the FDA first. Even if you're going to do the SP 510K, take it to the FDA first in advance of your submission and make sure that they see it the same way. This is a mistake that a lot of companies make, and every time I see it, I just laugh, because it's such a elementary school level mistake. Very easy to mitigate, if not completely eliminate, by taking it to the FDA first. In the guidance, let's take a look at just what I thought were a couple of the more aspects of this particular program. How do we show substantial equivalence to a standard? Well, FDA provides this table that explains it their way. Here's my explanation. This, to me, is a no-brainer. This is common sense. This is basic regulatory due diligence. You need to check the various databases, like, for example, the Recognized Consensus Standards database, the Guidance Document database, the Product Code database, because in the Product Code database, in the Product Codes, you'll see the oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes the special controls or the recognized consensus standards for whatever product code that you're working in. And that's the essence of the SP 510K, because when I show you in 1 or 2 slides from now where FDA comes up with these standards that you have to meet for the SP 510K devices, they didn't just pluck them out of the air. They didn't just make them up. They didn't even really think about it too much, quite frankly. It's a no-brainer. All you have to do is look at these different databases and to see what's available already, and you can generate your own list. So what goes into a SP 510K? Here's a list of the different sections. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading it to you, but the point that I want to make is there anything new or different here? If you've done other 510Ks, traditional, special, even abbreviated, the list of sections here is exactly the same. So there's really nothing different here. The most important part, the most important difference, which is not shown on this slide, is the performance standard determination, doing the testing that shows that your device meets that performance standard or that consensus standard. So how do we use that information to show substantial equivalence? Well, again, just a couple of highlights from the guidance. The FDA says we continue to recommend that you, meaning the manufacturer, identify a predicate even in the SP 510K. Why? In order to provide a comparison between your device and the predicate device, not in terms of performance, but in terms of indications and in terms of technology. So you heard that from me just a minute or two ago. This is common sense. This is regulatory logic. And as I said also, there's absolutely nothing new or unique here to the SP 510K because this is true for 510Ks across the board. Finally, FDA says, we do not expect you to provide a direct comparison of testing against a legally marketed device for performance specifications, because instead, we're going to be doing our testing to the standard. We're showing that our device meets the standard. And this is why I say that the SP 510K is very, very similar to, if not substantially equivalent to the abbreviated 510K, because that is exactly the idea of the A 510K. The only difference, and this is really the only difference between the two, is that in the SP 510K, you have a small universe of devices to choose from. I'll show you what that universe looks like in just a moment. Whereas in an abbreviated 510K, you have the entire medical device universe to choose from. As long as you can identify a standard or set of standards that cover your device, for the abbreviated 510K, you can choose anything you want. For the safety and performance-based 510K, you cannot, at least not yet. So once again, what, if anything, is really new here? And a little more from the guidance. FDA says, again, the same thing that I'm saying. Here's their words, not mine. When it comes to labeling, sterilization, shelf life, biocompatibility, all these other things, FDA recommends that the manufacturer who uses a SP-based pathway provide information as you would in a traditional 510K for the sections on labeling, sterilization, shelf life, biocomp, and so on. I mean, to me, I find it kind of laughable when I see in people's substantial equivalence table things like sterility and shelf life and biocompatibility, because to me, those things have nothing to do with substantial equivalence. All medical, I shouldn't say all, but most medical devices need to be sterilized. Most of them have to have some kind of a shelf life. Most of them, if it's coming in contact with a patient, needs to have some demonstration of biocompatibility. So that, I'm not saying that those things are not important. Of course they are important. But in my book, those things have nothing to do with substantial equivalence. Substantial equivalence is a direct comparison to either a predicate, if it's a traditional, or to your pre-changed device, if it's a special, or if it's an abbreviated or an SP 510K, the comparison to the standard. That's what you should focus on when it comes to substantial equivalence, not these other things. That just gets in the way. That's just noise. So the thing to remember, and again, it takes a little bit of mental thinking to kind of connect these dots. If we do an SP 510K and we're not using a predicate to show substantial equivalence in a performance sense, we still need a predicate to show substantial equivalence in the other senses, as I talked about before. I hope that makes sense. Just a few other things to go through before we get to the end and open this up to some Q&A and some discussion. So if you haven't already, be thinking about some questions and feel free to type those into the chat box, and then John will be our moderator and we can talk about those in just a few more minutes. What does a safety and performance-based 510K cost? Well, medical medical device user fees are associated with almost all submissions, including the 510K, and now including the safety and performance-based 510K. So all 510K submissions include these user fees. And if you're not familiar with the user fees, here's what they are for this coming fiscal year 2022. If you're a standard company, the 510K user fee is about almost $13,000. If you qualify for the small company discount, it's about $3,000. And by the way, for those of you in the audience that are in small companies and you want to try to qualify for a small company discount, you better allow yourself sufficient time to do that, because it takes 2 months to get a small company designation from the FDA, and then it takes another 2 months to go through the rest of the user fee system. So all in all, it can take 3 to 4 months to save you that few $1,000s. So in the last 510K that I submitted with a small company, they said, you know what, even though we qualify for the small company discount, the heck with it. We don't want to wait around for 3 or 4 months. We're going to just pay the $12,000 and be done with it. That's a decision that's up to you. But more importantly for our discussion today, unfortunately, all 510Ks have the same user fee. In other words, there is no financial incentive for doing a safety and performance 510K. Why not? I think if FDA, and to be fair, this is not FDA's decision, because FDA does not decide user fees. That's Congress's decision. But if Congress really wanted to encourage companies to consider and use the SP 510K, then they should give them a financial incentive to do so. For example, and I'm just throwing this out as a possible idea, you do a traditional 510K, you pay $12,000. You do a SP 510K and you pay $6,000. You get a 50% discount or something. Because right now there's absolutely no financial incentive for a company to do a special 510K. So how do you show substantial equivalence without using a predicate? As we talked about before, you show substantial equivalence to a standard, and since the other devices in that product code presumably also meet that standard, then your device is substantially equivalent to those. In other words, as I said earlier, the regulatory logic is if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. But you still need a predicate to demonstrate substantial equivalence of labeling, of technology, and so on. Ironic, isn't it? Yeah, it's definitely ironic, maybe even a little bit hypocritical, but that's the regulatory logic of the SP 510K. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of this particular 510K? On the positive side, it should be more objective and less subjective, at least the substantial equivalence and the performance-based portion of the substantial equivalence discussion. In other words, from an engineering perspective, you do these tests and you pass them or you don't. In other words, there's not a lot of objectivity there, as opposed to the way we determine substantial equivalence today. It's very, very touchy-feely. You know, I can make, to go off on a tiny bit of a tangent here, what a lot of people don't realize is when I go to the FDA with a 510K or with a de novo, it doesn't make any difference to me because I'm presenting exactly the same information. The only difference is when I want to do a 510K, I stress the similarities. When I want to do a de novo, I stress the differences. But at the end of the day, the information itself is exactly the same. The logic is the same here, right? So it should be a more objective process because we're ticking those testing boxes. And I'll show you an example of that in just a moment, as opposed to making a more subjective, a more objective, a more touchy-feely determination. As a result, it should be more predictable for both the sponsor as well as the FDA. I would argue that that's a good thing, so that we all know kind of going into the game what exactly we need to do. But this is also why I advocate having a pre-sub, to make sure that everybody knows what we need to do and everybody agrees that this is what we need to do. Overall, it should be a simpler or a more well-defined submission, but, and this is an important point, not necessarily a lower regulatory burden. In other words, don't think of the SP 510K as having to do less work. Instead, you're doing different work. So it's not a lower regulatory burden. Kind of like I have some customers who think that if you get a breakthrough device program designation, a BDP, that you'll be able to get the device onto the market with less work, a lower regulatory burden. Absolutely not the case. A BDP device is going to have exactly the same regulatory burden as a non-BDP device, exactly the same. The only difference is how you kind of get through the system, so to speak. And the last advantage of the SP 510K, and this is by no means a comprehensive list, is it should be at least theoretically less prep time for the sponsor to put it together, do the testing and put the submission together, and it should be less time for the FDA to evaluate it and come to a decision. Although, interestingly enough, according to the guidance, FDA is still allowing themselves the same review time, 90 days, for an SP 510K as well as the other 510Ks. So I find that very unfortunate, because just like we saw a moment ago, there's no financial incentive for an SP 510K. There's no time incentive for an SP 510K either. So we're not seeing an awful lot of incentives for companies really wanting to do this. And I remember even before the SP 510K was introduced, when it comes to the abbreviated 510K, a lot of people came to me and said, Mike, does abbreviated mean abbreviated? Does it mean less work? And I said to them, no, absolutely not. Abbreviated does not mean what you think it means. It's kind of like, to quote a famous politician, it depends on what your definition of is. So an SP 510K is not less work. It's not a lower regulatory burden. It's different work, showing conformance to the standard, as opposed to comparing to another device, a predicate device, for example. On the downside, the first one is a fairly minor one. There's no refuse to accept or RTA checklist specifically for the SP 510K yet, although perhaps FDA will create one. But to be honest with you, I'm not sure that we really need one, because we already have checklists for the other types of 510Ks, as well as the de novo and the PMA as well. So I think the RTA checklist that we use for the existing 510Ks is going to take us about 95 to maybe even 99% of the way there. Maybe we just take the 510K checklist and modify it slightly to create the SP 510K checklist, but we don't have one right now. It should take less time, an SP 510K, but it doesn't. It should be less money, but it's not. So again, there's, looking at the positives and the negatives, there's not a huge number of incentives, at least from my perspective. And if somebody can think of something that I'm missing, please feel free to share during the discussion. Not a lot of incentives for a lot of companies to start running in this direction. Almost to the end, and then we're going to open this up for Q&A. What types of devices are eligible for the SP 510K? Well, for right now, it is a very short list. A very short list. As a matter of fact, you can count the number of types of devices currently in the program on one hand. Let me just review what's in the top of the slide first, and this is just another screenshot from FDA's guidance. They reiterate the basic requirements that I've said already. The device has the same intended indications for use and the same technological characteristics. By the way, they should also, this is a mistake of FDA, they should not just say indications for use, they should say intended use, because both are equally important. And the technological characteristics do not raise additional questions of safety and efficacy, and they should also add, because this is not technically complete either, they don't change the overall risk. If you meet those criteria, as we talked about before, and you also meet the performance criteria that we're going to talk about next, then you could use the SP 510K, but you don't have to. Okay, so what devices qualify right now? That's in the middle box. So spinal plating devices, certain kinds of orthopedic bone screws, MRI coils, cutaneous electrodes, and conventional Foley catheters. Those are the only 5 categories of devices, as I said, you can count them on one hand, that are currently available for the SP 510K. But what's coming in the queue those guidances in the middle box there, those are all final guidances, whatever the heck a final guidance means. There really is no such thing. But they're final guidances, meaning that we can do an SP 510K if we're working in one of those areas. The technologies that you see at the bottom, the contact lenses, the denture resins, and the facet screws, those devices are in draft form. And once they become finalized, we'll be able to use the SP 510K for those. But perhaps the most important part of what's on this slide is the middle part. What if your device is not on this list? You, industry, may suggest devices. I've already submitted a number of suggestions to FDA. You can suggest devices for which there are comprehensive, and I think that's the most important word here, comprehensive, and the second most important word, FDA recognized consensus standards. Comprehensive FDA recognized consensus standards, because as some of you know, FDA does not recognize all standards. There are many ISO and UL and ASEM standards that FDA recognizes, but there are also a bunch of standards that they do not recognize. So there needs to be comprehensive FDA recognized consensus standards. If you're working in an area where you believe there are comprehensive and FDA recognized consensus standards, then by all means propose to the FDA that, hey, this is an area that we think would be a good candidate to add to the list of SP 510K devices. The only way that this program is going to grow is when companies and the people in them, like the people in this audience, do exactly that. Otherwise, this program is going to continue to sort of, wither on the vine, so to speak, kind of like the abbreviated 510K. The abbreviated 510K, as I mentioned earlier, was created in 1998, but only about 4 or 5% of 510Ks are brought onto the market under the abbreviated 510K. So if we want this program to grow, if you think there are advantages, or if you think the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, as I pointed out a moment ago, then we need to grow this program. Otherwise, it's just too limited, where we got too small of a universe. So where are we headed? So for each of those device categories that we saw on that previous screen, there's a corresponding guidance. I've just picked two of the more recent ones, the ones on the left for facet screws, the ones on the right for denture resins. Most of these guidances are very, very short, maybe 10 or 15 pages at the max. And when you strip out all the boilerplate, the you-know-what stuff, you really only have probably about 2 or 3 or 4 pages of actual important, useful information. And so this is why I asked the question, where are we going with this? Do we want a specific guidance like this for all well-established medical device technologies? I mean, we would be talking, potentially hundreds or maybe thousands of guidances like this. I mean, I'm not sure, to be honest with you, that that's an industry that I want to work in, and even if it was, how long will it take? What will it cost? But what's in there? Well, if we take a quick look, and this is, again, just as a random, at the denture resin guidance, what you'll see in here, among other things, and this is probably the most important thing in these guidances, is the specific testing that you have to do to show conformance to the standard. The specific testing, test number 1, and they specify exactly what it is. If it's an ISO test, what the performance criteria are, and so on. Test number 2, what it is. Test number 3, what it is, and so on and so on. So all you really have to do, I mean, you don't have to go to engineering school. All you have to do is, be a graduate of elementary school so that you know how to read. Here's the list of tests. You do all these tests. You pass all the tests. You tick these boxes, and you're done. Again, I'm being a bit facetious here, but I'm trying to illustrate an important point. That's the downside of this kind of an approach to the 510K, because it really removes most, if not all, of the thinking of this process. And once again, while I understand the appeal that this approach has to a lot of people, because let's be honest, a lot of people, both in industry as well as at FDA, they don't want to think. And so this is giving them an opportunity to not think, just simply follow the list here and tick off the boxes. I'm not sure that's really the direction that we want to go. But if you're going to do it, at least limit it, and this is exactly why it's limited to well-established technologies that have been around for a long time, technologies where we understand the risks and benefits, we understand the uses of the device and so on. We certainly would not want to take this approach. I would never advocate taking this approach for a new or a novel technology. Somebody asked me actually recently, could we use the same logic in the de novo, the same logic of the SP 510K in the de novo? And I said, absolutely not. I mean, that would have disaster written all over it in every language. So for 510Ks that are well-established technologies, even though it kind of ruffles me a little bit as a biomedical engineer, I'm okay with this approach to a certain degree, but not for, things beyond that. Okay, the last thing, and then we're going to wrap this up. What's the future of this program? Well, will it gain in popularity? In the end of the day, it depends on you all in this audience. If you start to utilize this program, and if you start to make SP 510K submissions, and or if you make suggestions to add new categories to that short list of SP 510K submissions, then I think that this program has a reasonable expectation to growing and expanding and becoming more and more popular. If not, it's going to remain as one of the more esoteric pathways onto the market that most people never use. And so, largely the decision is up to us. So wrapping this up, putting this in sort of regulatory terms, can the claims of the SP 510K be supported? Remember, as I started out in today's webinar, the claim of the SP 510K is that it is an expansion of the abbreviated 510K for certain well-established devices. So is the safety and performance-based 510K, is that nothing more than a label expansion based on the abbreviated 510K, using the abbreviated 510K as our predicate? Is the SP 510K not substantially equivalent to an abbreviated 510K, and therefore we should be thinking of the SP 510K more as a de novo? Or finally, is the SP 510K substantially equivalent to an abbreviated 510K, and thus it's another Me Too kind of a 510K? Please note that all of the above puns are 100% intentional. 100% intentional. I'm trying to, maybe you have to be a regulatory geek perhaps to appreciate my not so subtle use of humor here, but all of these puns are intentional. So to wrap this up, we've talked about the positives and the negatives about the safety and performance-based 510K. My final takeaways are the safety and performance-based 510K, in my opinion, is substantially equivalent to the abbreviated 510K. Again, pun intended. So do we really need it? In my opinion, no, because there's nothing that we can accomplish in the SP 510K that we could not, if we wanted to, accomplish in the abbreviated 510K. The only advantage of the SP 510K over the abbreviated is that, remember, as I said earlier, the A 510K, the abbreviated 510K, has the entire medical device universe to choose from. That's an advantage. The disadvantage is that those consensus standards or those testing methods have not been pre-vetted by the FDA. They haven't given us, in the form of those guidance documents, a list of tests to tick off the box. So the only difference, whether you consider this to be a significant difference or not, I'll leave it up to you. In the SP 510K, the FDA has sort of pre-vetted the list of testing that we have to do. But other than that, I see no difference, certainly no significant difference between the two. Beyond that, unfortunately, and I'm telling this to my customers now when they ask me about this, there's not a lot of meaningful incentives, but there easily could be. If Congress and FDA want industry to use this program, what about creating financial incentives? What about having a shorter timeline for review? Maybe even so far, and I'm just throwing out suggestions here, putting SP 510K submissions ahead of some of the other submissions so that they would get a more timely review if it uses less time, less resources, and so on. Just a suggestion, something to think about. Some people might like that idea, some people might not like that idea. So bottom line, consider the SP 510K if your device or your technology is on that accepted list that I showed you a few minutes ago, those 5 categories of devices that are right now and the 3 or 4 others that are in the queue, but confirm via a pre-sub first. And finally, make suggestions on what devices could be added to that list, or technologies could be added to that list for the future. So overall, I see the SP510K as sort of a mixed bag. It's got some advantages, it's got some disadvantages. At the end of the day, it's another option, it's another tool that we have in our toolbox. As I said at the beginning, you have to understand all of the all of the different options, all of the different pathways to market, and the advantages and disadvantages of each, and including the SP510K, and how it compares to all the other medical devices out there, medical device pathways to market out there, in order to decide which pathway, which option is the best one for you. So I know we've gone through a lot of information in a short period of time. I'm sure that some of you have some questions, comments. Maybe some of you want to agree with some of my comments. Maybe some of you want to disagree with some of my comments. I would love to hear some dissent from the audience if there is any. But I want to thank everybody for their participation and their attendance today. If there's anything I can do to help, you've got my contact information. Feel free to call me or send me an email. Be happy to help however I can. John, we've got another 10, 15 minutes remaining for some Q&A and some discussion. Yeah. Do we have any questions from the audience?
We do. We have quite a few, actually. So let's dive right in. The first question comes from Lars. Lars' question is, where do you categorize 510K exempt?
510K exempt. Well, I think, Lars, good question. If I understand your question, the word exempt in that context means you are exempt from a formal review of your device by the agency. In other words, if you are, I don't like the phrase 510K exempt. I think the better phrase is Class 1 or Class 2 exempt. What that means is you are exempt from, you do not have to submit a 510K or a de novo or a PMA or anything else. You are still an FDA regulated medical device. You still have to be FDA registered. You still have to have a quality management system. You still have to design controls, all that kind of stuff. But there's no formal review of your device by the agency in the form of a 510K or something else. Would you agree with that, John, or maybe you see his question a little bit differently?
No, I think that's spot on. I mean, it's always hard to gauge exactly the intent of the question, but Lars, if there's something we're missing, chime in with additional details, and we'll explore that. All right, next question comes from Shelley. Shelley asks, is the safety and performance 510K possible for software as a medical device?
Interesting question. Was it Shelley? Is that right?
Shelley. Yep.
Yeah, interesting question, Shelley. So theoretically, yes, if it would fit within one of those pre-approved buckets that I had on the screen a few minutes ago, the list of devices. I mean, I would have to go through myself and see if there's a piece of software that would fit. If you have, for example, a product code for bone screws, it's kind of hard to imagine how an SAMD, a software, a medical device, would be sort of equivalent to a bone screw. But there might be other categories in there that might apply, or even if there aren't, Shelley, I would encourage you, if you have a category of SAMD that you're working on that you think would be applicable, take FDA, take advantage of FDA's offered and go to them if there are performance standards, consensus standards, guidance documents that FDA recognized and they're comprehensive. Say to them, hey, here is medical device software that should be added to this program. I think that would be a wonderful thing to do. And Shelley, if you're interested, feel free to reach out to me. I would be happy to give you more specific suggestions on how exactly to make that happen.
All right, next question. Actually, Vinny asked 2 questions, but I think I could combine it into maybe one question with 2 parts. Does substantial equivalence predicate device need to be another 510K, or can a substantial equivalence predicate device be a de novo or PMA?
Great question, Vinny. So the short answer is, if it's a de novo, yes, because one of the things that results from a successful de novo is a new medical device that can be used as a predicate for somebody else's 510K. So for a de novo, it's a no-brainer. The answer is yes. When it comes to the PMA, that's a little more interesting because the PMA is for class 3 devices, obviously. And you can't use a predicate in the regulatory sense to get a PMA device onto the market. However, if you have a PMA device, let's say a barometal coronary stent, for example, that is indicated for atherosclerosis, we have dozens of those stents on the market and they're all class 3. And there's not a snowball's chance here in Southern California that you're going to get a barometal coronary stent through the FDA and onto the market for atherosclerosis with anything other than class 3. However, if you were able to change the indication, in other words, if you could put a barometal coronary stent in a coronary artery for some other reason, for example, maybe vasospasm, now at least it's theoretically possible that you could, via your risk mitigation strategy, lower your risk from class 3 PMA to class 2. And now doing that as a de novo or possibly as a 510K becomes a possibility. So great question, Vinny. On the de novo side, that's a no-brainer. Short answer is yes. On the PMA side, most regulatory textbooks and most regulatory professionals would say no, absolutely not. But quite frankly, I don't care what the majority says. It is theoretically possible, as I just described, to do it with a PMA as well. Hopefully that answers your question, Vinny.
All right. Next question comes from Courtney. Courtney asks for, quote, same indications and intended use. Can allowing it for home use / over-the-counter for a currently prescription device work under SP path if nothing else changed other than addressing home users?
So, Courtney, if I understand your question, usually, and again, it's really hard to give you a specific response to a pretty general question, but usually if you have a prescriptive device and you want to add OTC, or if you have a device that's indicated to be used in a hospital or some professional medical setting, and now you want to indicate it to be used in the home or outside of a professional hospital environment, usually that's not part of the substantial equivalence discussion. Yes, there would be additional testing. The most obvious kind of testing is usability. As John and I have talked about in some of our podcasts on usability, in my opinion, usability testing for home use devices used by people, as opposed to devices used by trained medical professionals in a hospital, for example, usability testing for those kinds of devices is much, much more important than for devices that are being used by trained medical professionals. Not to say that usability for devices for trained medical professionals is not important, but comparatively speaking, I think it's more important for usability is more important for non-trained medical professionals. And this is why I've said publicly many times that I think that the guidance and the requirements that FDA has on usability testing don't go nearly far enough for devices like that. But Courtney, coming back to your original question, in a general sense, there could be some exceptions. And if you are thinking of an exception, feel free to contact me. I'm happy to talk to you about it in more detail. But I don't usually see home use versus professional use, the intended user, or the intended use environment, whether it's sorry, I said it wrong. Intended user, whether it's an individual person or a doctor, or the intended use environment, whether it's a home or a hospital, that's really not usually part of the substantial equivalence argument most of the time. But of course, there are exceptions to every rule. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that a little bit, Mike. Courtney,
Sure.
One thing to consider, regulatory pathway aside, is sometimes when you're going into that home use, Mike's spot on, of course, with his comments on usability. Sometimes the home use environment can have other environmental impacts or influences, especially if you're dealing with like an mechanical medical device. So sometimes those may trigger additional things that you need to do to demonstrate safety and things of that nature in that home use. So just keep that in mind too. Next question comes from Brandon, and Brandon asks, if you choose the SP 510K or abbreviated 510K and FDA decides no, do you have to start over with a traditional 510K, or can during the additional information meetings change to a traditional 510K path?
Well, good question, Brandon. Thank you for asking. I think the first question that I would be asking before responding is, why is FDA saying no? Is it administratively? For example, you are submitting an SP 510K based on a device that does not fit into one of those predetermined categories that I had on the screen earlier. If that's the case, then I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but you won't qualify to use the SP 510K program. You could flip to an abbreviated 510K because, as I said before, the abbreviated 510K, you have your entire universe of medical devices to choose from. So if FDA says no because of administrative reasons, that would be one thing. If FDA says no because, I don't know, they have some problem with your substantial equivalence argument, let's say, again, you're going to an SP 510K, but FDA doesn't like your labeling. They don't think that your labeling is close enough to a predicate that you've identified, and so they're saying that you're NSE because of that. That would be another scenario. I mean, there's an infinite number of possibilities here, but the first thing that I would be doing in that case, Brandon, is I would be going back to the FDA and make sure I have a good understanding of why they're saying no. If they're saying no because we don't see this as a class 2 device, now you might be looking at potentially a class 3, a PMA, or maybe an HDE. So we have to find out. It's not sufficient, and you should not let FDA get away with simply saying no and nothing else. They have to give you a reason or reasons why. Hopefully that makes sense. John, is there anything that you would add or perhaps disagree with there?
No, I don't have anything else to add. Just looking at time, I'm going to pick one more question. And folks, a lot of you did ask some really great questions, and many of the questions that came in were very specific to challenges that you're faced with and the technologies and products that you're working with. You can see Mike's contact information on the screen. I would encourage you to reach out to him directly for those very specific questions. So let's see. Here's a good question. We'll make this our last one today, and this one comes from Jason. What happens if your predicate device goes off the market?
Good question, Jason. And again, thank you for Jason, for you, and for all the other questions. You're asking some great questions. And John, thanks for picking out some good questions here. So if your predicate device goes off the market, again, it's hard to respond unless we know why it's gone off the market. So the regulation says that for us to make a predicate comparison, and it doesn't matter SP 510K or any other kind of 510K, in order to make a predicate comparison, there has to be an active 510K, and that's it. There has to be an active 510K. The predicate device does not necessarily still have to be on the market. In other words, if the manufacturer of the predicate device decided to remove that device from the market because they've got a new version of the device and that older version is no longer being sold, that's fine. You can still make a predicate comparison to that other device as a predicate, even though it's not physically on the market. And the SP 510K would be a great way to do it, because if you want to make a comparison to a device that's no longer on the market, because it's not on the market anymore, you probably are going to have a difficult time getting a hold of one. Maybe it would be impossible for you to get a hold of one. And so how do you do your substantial equivalence comparison? Well, the SP 510K says that you don't have to do the comparison to another physical device. You instead do it to the standard. And so this would be a perfect opportunity to consider either the SP 510K, or before that, you would consider the abbreviated 510K. But, Jason, if the device was removed from the market, for cause, as my attorney friends like to say. In other words, because the device had problems, maybe it caused harm to people, maybe it was recalled, and so on and so on. Now it starts to get a little bit more interesting, because up until just a few years ago, you were allowed to make a predicate comparison to a device that was taken off the market because of a recall. Congress did close that loophole about 5 or so years ago, but the way they did it was problematic. That's a topic of a different discussion. So simply put, Jason, it's a great question, but in order to really give you a specific answer, we would first need to know why is that potential predicate device no longer on the market. Hope that helps.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for the informative session and the valuable insights during the Q&A portion.